Hey guys, welcome to The Last Hike. Today's story follows a couple who wired $25,000 to a guide and then decided that that money meant that they didn't have to listen to anyone.
It turned one reckless decision into a tragedy no amount of money could undo. It was September 19th, 2020. That's the date everything in this story actually started moving, but honestly, the seeds were planted weeks before that, sitting in a glow of a phone screen. Zara Colley and John DeRosa, a couple in their early 40s, had decided they were going to climb the east face of Half Dome in Yosemite, not the cables route. Not the thing literally tens of thousands of people do every single year with a permit and a steel cable to hang on to. No, they wanted something more exclusive. And the way they did their research was, get this, TikTok and drone footage. That's it. That was the extent of their due diligence for one of the more technical alpine rock faces in California.
When I read the report that they called the cable route demeaning and overcrowded, like it was beneath them or something, I just sat back in my chair.
There's a kind of person who sees a safety system used by regular families and retirees and thinks, that's not for me, I need something more cinematic. And look, I get wanting an adventure. I really do. But the moment you start treating a mountain like a backdrop for your personal brand instead of a genuinely dangerous piece of granite that doesn't care who you are, you've already lost the plot. Zara had inherited a company from her family, and John used to be her yoga instructor before they got together. Two people with money and time, but apparently zero humility about what they were walking into.
So you might be thinking, how do two people with no technical climbing background end up on a real trade route?
Well, they found a guy named Rio Chavez through a Craigslist ad. The ad literally said, private rock instruction. Not a registered guide service, not someone affiliated with any of the legitimate outfits that operate in Yosemite under permit, just a guy on Craigslist. Rio, it turns out, was operating as an unauthorized commercial climbing instructor, completely outside the legal permitting system the park requires. He had no wilderness first responder certification, which is something even moderately serious guides usually carry. He had about 2 years of experience transitioning from gym climbing to actual outdoor rock, what people in the climbing world sometimes call gym to crag. 2 years. That's barely enough time to get truly comfortable with your own gear, let alone be responsible for two complete strangers on an alpine wall.
Here's the thing that gets me every time I think about this case. All of these red flags were sitting there right in plain sight before a single dollar changed hands.
No certification, no legal standing to operate, limited experience, and Zara and John looked at all of it and thought, sure, let's wire this guy a small fortune. During their first phone call with Rio, he was actually pretty upfront, which I'll give him credit for in this one moment. He told them straight out that the east face route had no bolts, no fixed safety lines, and would require placing trad gear the whole way up, meaning cams and nuts wedged into cracks rather than the bolted anchors you'd find on a sport climb. He also told them flatly that the route turns lethal in afternoon thunderstorms, which is an extremely common weather pattern in the Sierra in the late summer. He even recommended a simpler alpine route instead, something more appropriate for their experience level. And Zara cut him off mid-sentence. She told him they were paying for solutions, not obstacles. Now that phrase tells you everything about how this entire trip was going to go.
When you treat a mountain guide's professional warning as an obstacle to be paid around instead of information that might keep you alive, you've already decided the outcome doesn't apply to you.
It's the kind of thinking that works great in business negotiations and falls apart completely the second gravity gets involved. They ended up negotiating a flat fee of $25,000 wired up front for a 2-day private climb. And Rio, despite knowing full well he had never personally led that exact route before and only owned a single rack of cams, which is honestly a pretty bare-bones equipment setup for a route like this, said yes. He took the money. And look, I'm not going to pretend like $25,000 is not a life-changing amount of money for a lot of people. When you're staring at that kind of payout, your judgment about your own limitations can get real foggy real fast. Before the trip even started, Zara and John went shopping, and this is where the story starts to feel almost like dark comedy if it didn't end the way it did. They went to an upscale outdoor retailer and bought ultralight Wiregate carabiners, ultralight daisy chains, and a pair of signature model climbing shoes that were a full size too small.
Now you might be thinking, for someone so rich, why use something too small? Well, according to them, it's because they looked sleeker.
They skipped the entire break-in period that climbing shoes need, where you wear them around to stretch the material and get a feel for them before committing to a multi-day technical climb in them. They also bought a drone and a professional camera rig, which added about 8 extra pounds to their packs. 8 pounds might not sound like much until you're hanging off a granite slab at 4,000 feet of exposure, and every single ounce matters for your balance and your energy reserves.
The shoe thing bothers me more than almost anything else in this whole story, and that's saying something given how it ends.
Climbing shoes that don't fit aren't just uncomfortable. They actively impair your ability to trust your footwork on technical terrain, which is exactly the skill you need most on a slab route like this. They chose looking good in photos over being able to safely stand on rock. That's the whole trip in one purchase. Rio sent them a mandatory gear list ahead of time. 4 liters of water per person, helmets, headlamps, warm layers for the exposed sections. Zara deleted the email. She just deleted it. John instead packed only 1 liter of water each for the entire approach and climb, explaining this away as weight efficiency. Meanwhile, he made room in his own pack for an expensive bottle of whiskey, intended for a summit toast. So water was expendable, but the celebratory drink was non-negotiable.
I don't know what else to say about that, except that it tells you exactly where their priorities sat.
They also turned down Rio's offer of a pre-hike practice session at a local crag, a nearby cliff where beginners typically get comfortable with gear, rope systems, and basic movement before attempting something bigger. Zara said their athletic backgrounds covered it. Her athletic background, for context, was spin class. John's was recreational basketball. Now, I do hoop sometimes, but these activities do not prepare your hands, your feet, or your nervous system for vertical granite.
This is the part where, if I were a friend of theirs, I would have begged them to reconsider.
Confidence built on the wrong foundation is maybe the most dangerous thing you can bring onto a mountain. The evening before the climb actually began was already a mess. They arrived at the Yosemite trailhead 3 hours late, and the reason was almost unbelievable. John had insisted on taking a scenic detour specifically to capture drone footage along the way. Rio had been waiting since dawn. Think about that. He lost an entire chunk of his planned preparation time. Daylight he needed to brief them, check gear, and mentally walk through the route. Also, John could get some aerial shots of scenery on the drive in. At the ranger station, things got worse. They lied to the rangers about their intended route, claiming they were doing the standard cables hike, specifically to dodge the permit check that would have applied to their actual technical climbing plan. Rio, who absolutely should have known better given this was his profession, went along with the lie.
That moment right there is, to me, the closest and clearest evidence that Rio had already lost control of this relationship with his clients.
He wasn't guiding them. He was being steered by them. And he let it happen because $25,000 was already sitting in his account. Once they got to the campground, Zara complained that it was too primitive and insisted they sleep in their rented luxury SUV instead of setting up camp properly. So the night before attempting a serious technical climb, they got cramped, broken sleep in the front and back seats of an SUV, compounded by John's snoring.
I don't think I need to explain why that's a bad way to prepare your body for a physically demanding day.
Climbing fatigue isn't just about the day of. It compounds from the moment you stop resting properly, and these two walked into day 1 already running on empty. That night, Rio laid out a detailed plan. Wake up at 4 in the morning, move fast and efficient, reach the base of the east face by 9, summit by noon. Be on the way back down before 2 in the afternoon, specifically to beat the afternoon lightning that builds reliably in that part of the Sierra. It was a smart, conservative plan built around the single biggest danger of this whole route, which was the weather window. Zara laughed it off and said they'd start at 8 instead, because sunrise photos were, in her words, non-negotiable. And Rio, again, just relented. This moment reveals the disaster taking shape. By delaying their start on a route known for dangerous afternoon storms, Rio and Zara gave up the very safety margin that could have protected them, all for sunrise photos they could have taken elsewhere. They then left 45 minutes later than Zara's already delayed plan because she spent time doing her makeup and arranging her hair for photos. On the approach, Zara repeatedly stopped to adjust painfully tight climbing shoes, then refused Rio's suggestion to switch to comfortable hiking shoes because she thought it would waste time, even though the repeated delays cost them far more time. Meanwhile, John was treating the entire hike like a film shoot. He flew his drone directly over Rio's head while Rio was working, at one point causing Rio to duck suddenly and nearly drop one of his cams, a piece of climbing protection that, if damaged or lost, could have left them under-equipped for the technical sections above. John just laughed it off and called it content.
I bring this up because it's such a small moment, but it tells you so much about the power dynamic on this trip.
Rio was the professional, the one whose judgment they were supposedly paying for, and he was being treated like a prop in someone else's video. Then they ran into a group of experienced climbers coming down from a different different route, and these climbers warned them directly about unstable weather building over the Sierra crest. This is a real, documented kind of trail encounter. Climbers descending often pass along weather intel to people heading up because conditions in alpine terrain change fast, and visibility from below isn't always reliable. Rio heard this and immediately pushed for a turnaround. John's response was to dismiss the warning entirely, suggesting those climbers simply weren't fit enough to continue.
I don't even know what to say to that one. It wasn't a fitness issue, it was a weather issue.
John just didn't want to hear it, so he reframed it into something he could dismiss. By 11 in the morning, they were already running low on water, which should surprise absolutely no one, given they'd each brought only 1 liter for a full day in the sun on exposed granite. Rio offered up half of his own remaining water, and Zara drank it without so much as a thank you, then complained that it tasted like plastic. Can you imagine if you were in Rio's position? This man was giving up his own hydration on a route where dehydration directly affects grip strength, judgment, and reaction time, and the response was a complaint about taste. There's a kind of person who simply cannot register when someone else is doing them a favor, and I think we were looking at 2 of them. Rio kept pointing out the darkening cumulus clouds building to the west, and he suggested, more than once at this point, that they abort and reschedule for the next day. Zara's response was to remind him that they had already paid and that $25,000 in her mind bought them a weather exception. They finally reached the base of the east face slab at 1:20 in the afternoon, more than 4 hours behind Rio's original schedule. Rio checked his satellite messenger device for an updated forecast. That's not a subtle shift. That's the kind of number that should end a climb on the spot for any responsible guide. Rio proposed bailing again. John accused him of trying to take their money without delivering the experience they paid for.
And Rio, faced with that accusation and the financial pressure hanging over him, caved.
The climbing began around 1:30 in the afternoon, leaving them with even less time before the usual afternoon weather. Rio led the first pitch, placing traditional protection and building a secure anchor before bringing Zara and John up one at a time. Zara refused to wear a helmet, struggled throughout the pitch, and incorrectly clipped her personal anchor system to a gear loop instead of her harness's belay loop. Although Rio immediately told her to fix it, she brushed him off and never corrected it. John then reached the anchor and clipped himself to a single bolt instead of the fully equalized anchor Rio had built. When Rio arrived after cleaning the route, he found both clients relying on the same single anchor point with no redundancy. He immediately resecured them correctly, but they complained that he was micromanaging them.
Now, before I go any further, I need you to understand that this single anchor situation is honestly one of the most quietly terrifying details in the entire story.
An anchor is supposed to be redundant specifically because any one point can fail, whether from gear placement, rock quality, or equipment wear. 2 adults paying clients on a serious alpine route were both clipped into one bolt on a slick mossy ledge, and their reaction to being corrected was irritation rather than gratitude. At this point, I don't think they understood, even on some basic level, that the rope and the gear were the only thing standing between them and a 200-foot fall. They were treating safety procedure like an inconvenience imposed by an overly cautious employee. Rio then led the second pitch, a steeper, more polished slab section with marginal friction, meaning the rock surface didn't offer much grip for hands or feet. He placed 2 small cams and a marginal nut along the way, gear that wasn't ideal but was what the rock allowed. At the top, he built a belay anchor, relying on an old 1/4-inch bolt, an outdated and weaker style of bolt than what's used in modern climbing anchors, backed up by a single marginal cam. He knew this anchor wasn't great. He decided to trust it anyway, because of the time pressure that had been building all day thanks to the 4-hour late start. Rio then belayed Zara up that pitch. Her too tight shoes caused her arch to cramp violently about halfway up, and she froze completely, yelling down at Rio for choosing such a footwork-intensive route, as if the rock itself had personally wronged her by requiring precise foot placement. Rio lowered her a few feet to a small foothold so she could rest. While she sat there cramping for about 10 minutes, John shouted up impatiently from below, telling her to push through it. Not concern, not patience. Impatience, because they were behind schedule, the schedule they themselves had blown up that morning over sunrise photos. By 3 in the afternoon, thunder was rumbling from the west, and the storm was now only about 10 miles away, which in mountain terms is uncomfortably close, especially with more thunder following close behind. Rio announced a mandatory retreat at this point, no longer a suggestion. Zara wanted to push to the next ledge instead, specifically for a better photo looking down into the valley. John backed her up, insisting they were almost there, even though they were only about 1/3 of the way up the actual route. Rio tried to explain, as clearly as he could, that lightning striking exposed granite is a fatal scenario, full stop. John responded with the idea that their rubber-soled climbing shoes would somehow insulate them from a lightning strike. This is not true. Rubber soles offer no meaningful protection from a lightning strike on an exposed rock face, and the fact that John believed this and stated it with confidence tells you just how little actual research had gone into this trip from the very beginning. Rio, by his own later account, was stunned into silence by that comment.
I don't blame him. I think I would have been too.
Rio then proposed an alternative. He would solo climb, meaning climb without being roped to anyone for that section, up to the next anchor point, fix a rope there, and then lower both of them down safely from that position. It was a reasonable plan to get them off the wall before the storm arrived. Zara vetoed it immediately because rappelling down meant no summit, and in her mind, they hadn't paid $25,000 for a failure. She insisted on pushing for one more pitch instead. This is where Rio actually drew a line, for once. He told them flatly that he would not continue, and Zara's response was to threaten to fire him on the spot, write a damaging review, and remind him very specifically that his liability waiver was flimsy and that she happened to know a lawyer. Rio, who was terrified of financial ruin given that he was already operating illegally without proper authorization, relented yet again. Rio led the third pitch anyway, a thin crack section with genuinely poor protection options. He managed to place a single small cam, a size that climbers would call .75, into rock that was flaring, meaning the crack widened in a way that made the gear less secure than it would be in a parallel-sided crack. He reached a stance and built an anchor again, relying on an old quarter-inch bolt, the same outdated style as before, backed up by another marginal cam. He brought Zara up to that anchor first. By 4:15 in the afternoon, Zara arrived at Rio's new anchor, completely exhausted, dehydrated from the lack of water all day, and her previously cramping foot was now spasming on and off. Rio told her clearly to clip into the bolt using her personal anchor system and just wait there while he prepared to bring John up next. That instruction was simple, and it should have been the easiest thing in the world to follow. But Zara, impatient and in real physical pain at this point, decided on her own, without asking Rio, to unclip from the anchor so she could shift a few feet to the right, to a stance that felt more comfortable. In her haste, she twisted the sleeve of her locking carabiner, but never fully screwed it shut, meaning the supposed safety lock on that carabiner wasn't actually engaged. As she leaned over to that new position, her foot slipped on a section of polished granite, the kind of smooth, glassy rock surface that offers almost no friction. She stumbled forward and grabbed for the anchor bolt with her free hand. Her carabiner gate brushed against the bolt hanger in the process, but never actually clipped onto it. In that instant, she was completely untethered, standing on a 45-degree slab with no real handhold to grab. John had just arrived at the stance directly below her right as this was happening, and he saw her losing her balance. He lunged upward across a 3-foot gap, trying to grab her by the waistband to stop her from falling. But his own daisy chain was still clipped into the lower anchor, and as he lunged, it wrapped around his right leg and twisted his harness into what's essentially a bind, locking his leg in an awkward position. While he was trying to untwist himself from that bind, he shifted his weight onto a loose flake of rock, a section that looked solid but wasn't actually attached securely to the wall behind it. The flake broke off under his boot. He pitched sideways and in doing so pulled Zara by her jacket as he fell. Both of them slid downward across the slab together. Zara's open carabiner offered no actual connection to anything solid, and John's daisy chain, twisted around his leg, was the only thing still attached to a fixed point, that lower old quarter-inch bolt. As they slid, that daisy chain went taut, suddenly taking the combined weight of both of their bodies plus all their gear in what's called a shock load, an extremely violent, sudden force far beyond what a static load would produce. The old quarter-inch bolt, already a weaker and outdated piece of hardware, failed instantly under that force. From there, they tumbled past the second anchor point and past the other gear Rio had placed along the route, pieces that were already widely spaced and only marginally secure to begin with. Each one sequentially pulled out of its flaring placement as the force of the fall traveled through the rope and gear system. They fell freely for about 80 feet down the slab, striking several small ledges along the way, before finally coming to rest on a wide, flat talus slope roughly 200 feet below the route. Neither one of them was moving. Rio was still up at the anchor for the third pitch when all of this happened, and he watched the entire sequence unfold from above, completely unable to do anything about it. He had just unclipped his own belay device to prepare for the next transition, which meant there was zero tension on the rope to catch either of them. He screamed, but there was no one else within earshot to help. Rio reportedly froze in place for about 12 minutes after the fall, which honestly doesn't surprise me given what he had just witnessed. Eventually, he made a panicked mayday call using his satellite communication device. Search and rescue arrived by helicopter roughly 2 hours later, and by that point, lightning had actually moved into the area, which significantly hampered the rescue operation. The bodies were recovered at dusk that evening. I think about Rio sitting up on that ledge for those 2 hours, alone, having just watched 2 people he had spent the last day with fall to their deaths.
Honestly, whatever frustration I have with how he handled the lead up to this trip, I don't think anyone deserves to carry that alone on the side of a mountain.
The autopsy results confirmed that both Zara and John died from blunt force trauma sustained in the fall. John's neck was broken. Zara suffered massive internal injuries. Investigators who examined their harnesses afterward found incorrect clipping configurations and webbing that showed clear wear from the slide down the rock face, physical evidence matching exactly what Rio later described happening in those final minutes. The investigation that followed uncovered the full picture of how illegitimate this whole operation had been from the start. Rio had no authorization whatsoever to operate as a commercial climbing guide within Yosemite National Park. Investigators traced the entire arrangement back to that original Craigslist ad and the $25,000 wire transfer that started it all. Rio ended up facing manslaughter charges, which were later reduced through a plea bargain down to charges of criminal negligence. The families of Zara and John pursued a lawsuit against him afterward, but by that point there was essentially nothing left to collect. The money from the climb itself had already gone toward paying off Rio's own personal debts, long before any of this ever reached a courtroom.